So things are changing. If you were to get into the South African market 5 years ago, even just before COVID, things would have been different. But our current crisis has really catalyzed developments in the private sector investment space.
Complexity is normal when it comes to the reality of the African continent, also in terms of energy supply and security. The continent has a vast solar potential, with several Saharan countries belonging to those with the highest solar radiation worldwide. At the same time, electrification in Africa is still one of those core issues to be addressed within the Millennium Development Goals, especially in the rural areas. The huge solar potential faces political, infrastructural, regulatory, and economical challenges. So, what's necessary for an unrestrained development of solar on the continent? We'll have a look into the African solar market developments in this episode. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized, and digital, bringing together electricity, heat, and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. For this episode, once again, I was very happy to talk to two experts at the same time. On the one hand, Dr. Rethabile Melamu, Chief Executive Officer at SAPVIA, the South African Solar PV Association. She's been a scientist and researcher also into topics such as renewable energy, hydrogen, bioenergy from waste, and much more, and has acted as an executive member of various green tech organizations. And on top of that, I'm also pleased to welcome Herbert Friese. He has been general manager of Dutch and CO for more than 10 years and has been a key driver of the energy transition in Ghana. Apart from that, he's also chair of the work group for solar companies of the AGI, the Association of Ghana Industries. We had a really extensive topic ahead of us, a vast continent to look at with various markets and countries. So of course, this is going to be a real deep dive with a lot of details and a longer episode. You can look forward to quite a lot of information. And with that, we jump right into the episode. Welcome, Tabi. Welcome, Herbert.
Good morning, Zach. It's great to be here.
Hi, Zach. Thank you for having us.
Well, we have a lot of questions ahead of us. And of course, the African continent has a huge variety of markets and different contexts and scenarios. So I think in order to dive in there in detail, this certainly will be a longer episode. But let's start with one of the most important questions first. Of course, from a purely European perspective, mostly when we talk about green hydrogen in Africa, we are talking about importing green hydrogen in our European market. But how controversial is that view actually, Tabi, when 64% of the rural population in Africa still has no access to electricity at all?
Well, I don't think it's that controversial, to be honest, Zach. I think it's an opportunity for the continent. The continent needs a lot of foreign direct investment to grow their economies. We have the land. It's one of our greatest assets as a continent. We have the resources. The continent has the best wind and solar resources. And so I think this provides an opportunity for us as the African continent to exploit the resources that we have. Of course, we need to set parameters. There has to be boundaries so that there is no exploitation of any sorts and that there real benefit out of these types of investments. However, I'd like to say that as we exploit these new opportunities that are presented by green hydrogen, we need not lose sight of the challenges that we faced. You talked about a 64% statistics. In fact, in numbers, it's 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who do not have access to clean forms of modern energy. And that's really a mammoth task for African governments to really focus on. And because green hydrogen require renewable energy, I think the investments in renewable energy needs to be looked at through these two lenses, exploiting the new opportunities, but also making sure that we ensure that we work towards getting this majority of our population access to electricity. So really, it's not controversial. I'd say let's exploit the opportunity and grow the economies of our continent, but let's do so without forgetting our fundamental commitments to our people, which is to provide energy, which I consider a basic need for an African child on this continent.
Thanks, Tabi, for giving us like the general overall picture. Now, let's dive right into the details itself and into some very technical questions and economical questions, Herbert. The increased module prices over the last 2.5 years, how have they affected the African market? And the African market in brackets, I mean, there is not the African markets. I guess there's various markets all across the countries. So maybe you can point out various examples or scenarios.
Pleased to do so, Zach. I mean, you rightfully make a distinction between, let's say, Africa as a continent and let's say the different markets within Africa. But I think in general, over the last few years, we've all suffered, let's say, from price increases, especially from the two particular areas, one being the PV modules and the other being the cost of freight. And these two have contributed to an overall rise in project costs of anywhere between 5 to 8%, being made up of, let's say, when you look at the PV modules, these rates went up because of, let's say, the general increase in commodity prices and also shortages in, let's say, the ground material that is used to produce solar panels. And these prices went up as far as 20% over the last 2 years. And taken into consideration that PV modules are a component of a total system, the total installation cost would have gone up with about 5% across Africa, I would say. With the freight part, that was really quite a shocking situation whereby the prices went 5 to 6-fold, going from, let's say, $2,000 to $3,000 for a 40-foot container leaving China towards the African continent, suddenly costing between 6 to 8 and even 12 to 15 at some point, $1,000 for the same container. And whereby I also dare to say that some of these margins were artificially kept high in order to gain some more profitability for mainly the solar manufacturing companies. So yeah, it had an effect. It had an effect on the way we construct, let's say, the terms of the lease and rental agreements. The length of term, which is normally around 8 to 10 years, had to go to 12 to 15 years to make the numbers work. But also, let's say, we had to renegotiate prices with clients that had received rates for solar installations, which is not the nicest thing to do, as you can understand. So the impact has been great. It's still not completely over, even though the freight prices have come down to more or less where they were before. But the module rates are still, they've stagnated, but they're still much higher than they were a year and a half ago.
Right. Thank you, Herbert. Tabi, do you have anything complementary to add, or maybe also are you aware that those general dynamics that Herbert has described has affected various markets or countries differently?
Yes, Zach, it has definitely affected even the South African market differently. If you consider the utility scale projects that are procured through a government initiative called the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, a number of projects that were procured could not close because the prices had gone up drastically from pre-COVID time to during COVID time. So we've seen some of the projects not closing. They did not reach financial and legal close. So that was a big challenge. And some of these projects haven't closed and it's been 2 years. And some of them will probably never close because obviously the investors would have moved on. However, in the domestic market, residential, commercial and industrial spaces, we have seen growth despite the increase in the module prices. And really the reason being that South Africa is experiencing unprecedented episodes of load shedding. So on a typical day in South Africa, we don't have power for 10 hours in a day. And that has led to people looking for options to shield themselves against load shedding. So really, I think it's more of a survivalist, a phenomena that we have observed. that has trumped the impact of the actual module price increases. So really, that's what we've been observing in South Africa in the past 2 years. We have seen the prices going down a little bit, and some of the projects in the private sector, utility project in the private sector, are starting to take off, but the residential market is just growing exponentially in South Africa.
Thank you, Tabi. Now, those was more like a view into the past months and the status quo. Now, looking forward and also seeing that module prices are normalizing again, in your eyes, how do public-private partnerships, so PPPs, come into reforming energy systems in Africa? Do you have like one or two good examples?
I think South Africa has a great example. The model I just mentioned, a program that government launched in 2011. It's called the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. Really, what it is it entails government procuring electricity from private players, private producers, because obviously most governments, including South Africa, have constrained, in a fiscal constraint currently. And so they have been running that program for 12 years, and they've been able to procure more than 7 gigawatts of power, both renewable and energy. And we're seeing them utilizing the same model to procure battery storage and possibly transmission networks or infrastructure will probably be procured through these PPP projects. That is really one of the hindrances for the uptake of renewable energy in South Africa. The reason being that areas with excellent solar and wind resources have run out of transmission capacity. They can't connect to the grid. There is a need to reinforce and expand that grid, and the government is exploring the possibility of utilizing public-private partnerships to develop that infrastructure. But we have seen it working really well in the South African context. And I think it's a good model. It's not without its challenges. However, it has demonstrated that the private sector can play a critical role in infrastructure rollout.
Thank you, Tabi. Now, Herbert, do you want to complement the picture with your insights in Ghana? And maybe if you do have also insights into other markets in Africa or countries in regards to PPPs.
It's great to hear from Tabi that the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program works very well in South Africa. Here in Ghana, we have a different experience whereby we also went through a period of what we call doomsor, which means on and off, whereby Ghana went through a power crisis in, let's say, in the period 2016 to 2018, and whereby the load shedding was severe for a longer period of time. That was followed by an haphazard signing of off-taker contracts between Ghana government and private independent power producers, whereby the terms and conditions that were negotiated were not favorable to Ghana. And there was also a heavy oversigning in capacity, kind of capacity that the national grid could not even take. So that has led now to a moratorium on the implementation of utility-scale solar, but also a very negative approach towards take-or-pay clauses that are normally giving some security to the private power producers. And in Ghana's economic situation at the moment, Ghana cannot give any government guarantees. So that makes it a difficult scenario in order to move forward on the utility scale solar in a public-private partnership. And it's been worked on, let me be very clear on that. So there is progress. But I also think that it's very important executing these PPPs because it's a partnership, that the policies need to be developed to support these public-private partnerships. And also that the legal and regulatory framework is well laid out. So that everybody knows what they're getting into and how they're going to work with each other, because these are 20 to 25-year agreements. Besides the fact that the risk needs to be shared somehow. So I'm glad to hear that in South Africa there's a very good, let's say, experience with this, and I think Ghana can potentially look at the South African model and see if it can be replicated to make it a success.
And just very quickly in one statement, maybe, Herbert, do you have some insight into other countries or markets where you think like they really have figured it out, and that's, for example, a good role model other countries could look into in Africa?
I mean, when you look at North Africa, which from a renewable point of view makes up, I believe, 40 to 45% of the total installed capacity of renewable energy, I would assume, but that's a difficult thing to do, but I would assume that there is a proven concept, which may be the reason why so much private funding is going towards Northern Africa. South Africa is on itself a very important country, ranking second, I believe, in the recipient, being a recipient of a private sector based funding. So I don't know the details of that, but fortunately we have Tabi here to explain that further to us. But I believe North Africa would be another option to look at. But I don't have any first-hand experience with that.
No problems. Thank you, Herbert. Now, we talked about PPPs. If we purely focus on private investments as such, I think it's been a challenge so far for the energy transition in Africa. So maybe, Tabi, you can actually pick up the ball that Herbert just threw you and extend your answer in regards to private investments as such. How is the market evolving in this regard?
Thanks, Zach. Herbert, definitely, I think the examples that you're giving of North Africa, the northern part of the continent, I think Egypt has a great model that other countries can learn from. Also, Morocco has done a lot of work in that space. South Africa has gone under several reforms, regulatory reforms that has enabled the private sector to operate in this space. In the past, embedded generation licensing was required for projects over 1 megawatt. So if you are a private developer looking to deploy renewable energy or develop a renewable energy project, you needed to go to the regulator. The regulator needed to give you a license for you to develop a project. However, due to our energy challenges currently, the government has removed the need for private developers to get a license, regardless of the size of the project. And so what we have started seeing is investments in utility scale projects by the private sector. That cap, that license cap was removed in 2022. And in just 2023 alone, we have seen more than 2 gigawatts of private projects being registered with the regulator. Sure, those projects have not been developed yet, but it does demonstrate that when the regulatory reforms or the regulatory environment is conducive, the private sector can actually invest. So again, this is a good model, but it was driven by crisis in the South African point of view. So sometimes it requires a crisis to get countries in the right path. And so really this was driven not just by will, I would say, to see a huge uptake of renewable energy projects. Maybe it would have come online 5-6 years down the line, but it has happened in South Africa. And so we have seen huge investments. The green hydrogen opportunity that we spoke about at the beginning of this podcast, Zach, has led to some significant investments. You probably are aware of the Just Energy Transition investment that some of the European countries from the West have made in South Africa. Some of it will go through towards grid strengthening. However, we are seeing all sorts of funding, not just from governments, but the private sector itself invests in the renewable energy sector. So things are changing. If you were to get into the South African market 5 years ago, even just before COVID, things would have been different. But our current crisis has really catalyzed developments in the private sector investment space.
Thank you, Tabi. And now we talked about private-public partnerships. We talked about private investments. Last, we need to focus on exclusively public funding. So as I understand, it's still necessary for the widespread deployment of solar in African countries. At the same time, it also has the potential to lead to distortions of market prices. So what's your judgment, Herbert? How can you achieve an ideal balance of all of these three, and specifically with public funding?
Yeah, first to get back to what Tabi just said. I mean, I think the key word here is growth and progress. I think on the continent, and I mean, I've been in Ghana since 1994, so for quite a while. And in the West African market, we have seen also, leaps and bounds. Of course, the advantage that we all have is that we don't need to make the same mistakes in trying out technology that initially doesn't work and that costs an enormous amount of money. From an African perspective, we can tap into proven technology and proven business models that need to be moduled towards our needs and make sure that the receiving country also benefits from it. That's very important. Also here, from our side in West Africa, we see that there is an enormous amount of progress in the policy making to enable the environment more for private and public investment. However, the public funding, which is very often absorbed by infrastructural development, which is, of course, a very big area to cover in most African countries, is still necessary to widespread the deployment of solar. The distortion of the market prices in the past are a concern, and some of them are to be solved by reducing the inefficiency caused by fossil fuel subsidies. A lot of the governments are still subsidizing fossil fuel subsidies that benefit mainly the coal and the oil producing companies. And these subsidies, they drain the public finances and they also discourage investment in renewable energy. I think that's one area of looking at. Another area is that the enabling policies, the creation of enabling policies to encourage private investment to invest in renewable energy are key in this. And like Tabi just said, this enabling environment is being created as we speak, also because we learn from the crises that we go through. And then, of course, there needs to be a coordinated effort to collect data so that we know that we're paying a fair price in Africa and that we're not being used as a dumb continent for old technology, or where we are being used for, let's say, creating more market share outside of the continent. For example, which is what happened with the transport rates. You cannot justify a price increase of 600% in my view, just like that. Something to talk about, and which is a good development, is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is currently very much a topic of discussion between all countries within the African continent. This new African Continental Free Trade Area will fully ratify, and when it's fully ratified by all African countries, will become the largest free trade area under the World Trade Organization rules, integrating 55 African economies. And this then will become a powerhouse. So the development and the discussion on on this trade area is extremely important and a game changer for Africa's development. I mean, if it's implemented well, theoretically, it will increase the volume of inter-African trade by 81% by 2030, 2035. And it will increase the volume of total African exports by 30%. And these are the numbers that were crunched a year ago.
All right.
New reports are coming out today, actually, in a new report which is going to be published by the International Energy Association.
That's really some steep development and good numbers there, Herbert. Tabi, would you agree? Would you like something to add, or do you even disagree with some things that Herbert said?
Not at all. I totally agree. I know we're agreeing on anything with Herbert, but I fully agree on the Africa Free Trade Initiative. I think it's going to be a game changer. I think African states are also putting enough effort and support. The establishment of the Secretariat, I think, signals commitment to ensuring that it is implemented properly and that it makes the impact that it's intended to. So I totally support Herbert on that. And yeah, I am not aware of recent figures, but what Herbert is quoting is really exciting for me, and it will catalyze development in the continent, which is what we all work towards. So really good. I think maybe just to add on the public funding, in addition to Herbert's great insights and inputs, I do see it as a catalyst for unlocking private sector. So I think public funds, which are limited for the reasons that have already been outlined, needs to unlock funding, great business models that can perhaps unlock funding into microgrids and mini grids in some of the remote areas, or in making sure that the infrastructure goes to the most remote areas of our continent, and that even those people do get access to clean forms of modern energy. So I don't think public funding will address all the needs, the energy needs, or all the infrastructure needs that the continent has. But if it's used creatively to unlock opportunities, then I think governments and the states would have done well.
If I may, Zach, one more thing to add on the role of public-private partnerships and also the role of, let's say, governments is we need to understand that, in my view, Africa, the need is to invest in transmission lines. So, of course, as much as we are all pushing the renewable energy agenda, and in our particular case, mainly the solar agenda, we also need to understand that for that to happen, the national grid needs to be stable and needs to be able to take in the new capacity that's coming online. So a lot of the money would be needed to invest in transmission lines that are also interconnecting with other countries so that export of power can also be established. And the funding required for that is maybe less popular than the renewable energy funding at the moment, but it's very much needed.
I think that comes back to something that Tabi mentioned earlier in one of his statements, that also was a bottleneck in South Africa. Now, Tabi, you just mentioned mini-grids and off-grid installations as really a very important puzzle piece to bring electricity to, specifically, I think you said the 600 million in sub-Saharan Africa that are still not connected to electricity, for example. Now, that's really interesting because these are solutions that are not so common here, of course, from a European perspective. So maybe you can give us some great examples about mini-grid and off-grid, how big their share is going to be in that cake, and, for example, also how mobile phone payment plans are coming into play.
I think it's very clear to most African policymakers and those that are at the forefront of its implementation that the current model of delivering electricity to all its citizens will have to change. So currently, most countries are only able to provide electricity to urban areas. And really, that's because Africa is vast. We have ample of land, and we tend to be sparsely populated. Our villages are far apart, and really the centralized model does not work. It becomes extremely expensive for a constrained fiscus. And so there is a huge opportunity in the decentralized type of solutions or infrastructure that targets specific regions or villages. And that's where the microgrids and the mini grids can play a significant role. And what is fantastic about renewable energy is that it's modular. You can deploy it at all different sizes. And so you are able to go to village A and set up a system there, maybe solar PV alongside battery storage to ensure a sustainable and consistent supply to those villages, as opposed to developing this massive infrastructure that is not really fully utilized. We know that taking electricity to those parts tends to be expensive because of the geographical nature of Africa. There are great examples. You are right, Zach, that we have embraced mobile innovations as a continent. We've seen it in the payment environment, ICT space. But we're already seeing some fantastic models. Some are not really mini grids. So I'd like to give you an example of an initiative in a small country landlocked in South Africa. It's called the Kingdom of Lesotho. It happens to be my country of birth. What is typical of Lesotho is the mountainous nature of it. So in the highlands, most areas are about 3,000 meters above sea level, and particularly difficult to access by road. And therefore, most of those villages still do not have access to energy. We have a company that has deployed all sorts of energy solar solutions to those villages, and they are facilitating payments via mobile phone. So that company, I think, is called Khanyisa. Khanyisa is able to provide lighting, cell phone charging, and a bit of solar cooking to these villages at about, I don't know how much that is in dollars, but it's about 100 Rand a month, which those villages are able to afford. So that really saves them time. Typically, they would travel 2 hours to charge a mobile phone. But with these solutions, they're able to, pay 100 Rand remotely and only travel when they really need to. So it really sounds like a basic solution, but it has really changed the lives of those villages in several villages in the remote parts of Lesotho. That's just one example, and I know there are plenty of examples across the continent.
Thank you so much, Tabi. Those are really great visual examples. I can literally imagine and see it in front of my eyes how relevant the technology is and how great it's being put together. Herbert, is there one very different scenario that's also interesting to hear?
There are several scenarios. The good thing about and the success of these pay-as-you-go financing models is that it obviously helps low-income consumers to avoid the upfront cost and risk of investing. And it's very important that they can always have their phone charged in order to make the payments. Now, when you look at the effect on the mobile phone operators, because it's a win-win situation, then the numbers are speaking for itself. If you look at a case, for example, in Uganda, the mobile phone operator saw its volume going up with 76% after a solar pay-as-you-go scheme was introduced. In Ivory Coast, that was 31%. So the consumer is enormously helped by these business models, but the mobile phone operators are also growing exponentially, which is a very good thing to see because it means that the system works. Now, unfortunately, there's always governments that see this and they look at it and they say, okay, let's slap a tax on mobile money in order to follow this growth and also earn some money out of, this new development. But it's very much growing. I mean, in Ghana, we've recently seen the taking over of PAC Africa by Bbox. PAC Africa, I think, is a trailblazer when it comes down to this solar pay-as-you-go system. They had in excess of 750,000 homes connected to their infrastructure, and they were recently taken over by Bbox, who has taken it to another level. You also have different providers that provide, let's say, so-called solar kits, whereby very small-scale solar for purposes of providing light, providing a charging unit to households at very lengthy payment plans that favor the consumer. But other than solar, you also see, for example, a company like CityTaps that provides prepaid smart meters that are also linked to mobile phone money. In Ghana, we have something that we call Saved Water Network, whereby people can buy clean water with mobile money. So I think in general, the whole business model of being able to pay with your mobile phone for energy and water resources is a magnificent solution for the many people that have no connectivity to the grid.
Now, you just mentioned how important mobile phone payment plans are to address various issues, and you gave me a perfect segue for my last question with a slightly different angle, and that is, how can solar PV contribute to really solving other pressing issues, such as, for example, access to clean water, or help farmers really manage their crop farming better?
Thank you, Zach. I mean, one of the programs that we're running at the moment with the work group for solar of the Association of Ghana Industries is looking for a solution of solar-driven water pumps. This for irrigation for the local farmers. It's an important project to do because the individual farmers are relatively small and don't have the kind of income and the kind of collateral in order to provide security for a loan. So the idea here is to go to the corporations and ask the corporations to stand guarantor for these individual farmers. Now, from my own experience, what is important is the irrigation side of things, to solarize that, but also dehydration of food products, for example, fruits. If you look at mango farmers that like to dry their fruits in order to package it for domestic and export products for consumption, They need drying units that need to be that consume a lot of power. So that's another solar solution that would definitely help development issues. The storage facilities that are required in order to store vegetables and fruits and other products before it can go to the market, to provide, let's say, cooling and to provide air handling in those storage facilities by the use of solar, is something that is currently already happening and being rolled out. The only challenge still is the access to funding for these projects.
So we come back to what we discussed earlier in regards to funding.
Absolutely.
Now, that was already quite an extensive list of various applications, how PV can come into play to really solve other issues. Is there anything that Herbert forgot to mention, Tabi?
Not really. I think maybe to add to Herbert's point, Zach, one thing about solar, although it's difficult to find financing for the solutions that he's mentioned, is that it really is versatile. So it can be applied across sectors. We have seen solar applications in tourism, which is really exciting that villages that are in far-flung areas of the continent have started embracing solar. And with that, their tourism products have really been enhanced. I think great examples that Herbert mentioned in the agricultural space. Incidentally, yesterday I was at a conference in Association of Essential Oils and Vegetable Oils, and to see how much they are embracing solar technology in the drying, in the extraction of essential oil was really heartening. So we're seeing good cases coming out of the continent. What governments across the continent need to do is to incentivize use of solar PV for economic productivity, not just in the agricultural spaces, but in all other sectors that deliver services such as the health sector, as well as education sector in schools across the continent.
Thank you, Tabi. And what's quite interesting is that you mentioned that PV is coming into play, for example, in the production process, I think, is essential oils, you said. So if for some of these products were not to be used in the domestic market, but also would, for example, be shipped to Europe, that would give an additional benefit in regards to all new requirements for a low carbon footprint, for example. So I guess that even creates an additional benefit.
Absolutely. In actual fact, that project is being supported by SECO. So Europe is investing quite a lot in these markets and in the ability to produce quality products for export. And they've identified energy as having a big role to play in ensuring that these SMMEs, mainly SMMEs, are able to produce the volumes that would be attractive for export.
Thank you so much, Tabi, and thank you so much, Herbert. We had a really complex and diverse topic ahead of us, and I think both of you made a great job of highlighting various specific examples all across the African continent, and it's been a really vivid and great insight into what's happening in various African contexts and countries. Thank you so much, Tabi.
Thank you, Zach. It was great having this conversation with yourself and Herbert. Thank you.
And thanks a lot to you, Herbert.
Thank you very much, Zach, and thank you, Tabi. I think the word is progress, and we keep on going and pushing the agenda of renewable energy. But thanks for giving us the opportunity to first and foremost share experiences and share our thoughts, and we hope the listeners are taking a benefit out of what has been discussed.
For more information on current developments in the PV market in Africa, please check out the SolarRise Africa Report 2023. It is available as a free download on our website, so check out intersolar.de.